We're back at it, and today we're going to talk about Cold War historiography. And this is a topic that the IB loves to throw on paper too, for at least their first question for you. So today we're going to run through all of the different viewpoints as to what contributed to the cause of the Cold War, starting with ideology. Now, ideology is just a worldview, the way someone thinks. And obviously, the United States and the Soviet Union have competing ideologies: Soviet communist authoritarianism versus American democratic capitalism. And these two are opposing each other. They can't coexist. There have been long-time animosities between these two competing ideologies, going all the way back to the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the Red Scare that developed in the United States in the years after. Note, that is a different Red Scare than the 1950s Red Scare. This is an early 1920s American Red Scare. Those salami tactics by the Soviet Union, along with the Czechoslovakian coup and the Berlin blockade, showed the United States, at least, that these were clear attempts of the Soviet Union to try to spread their communist ideology. The Soviet Union also encouraged the spread of worldwide communist movements through both its early Comintern and later Cominform organizations. The Marshall Plan on Stalin's side was seen as dollar imperialism, the United States using their economic might to spread their capitalist free market economies. And the United States, of course, was supportive of free trade and open markets to support its capitalist economy. And so that kind of lends us right into economic causes of the Cold War. By 1949, two opposing economic systems were established in Europe, whether it be the American support of open markets and the American dollar becoming the base currency of what was known as the Bretton Woods system, created in the aftermath of World War II, the currency that other currencies would place their value against. This is going to create disputes and economic concerns for the Soviet Union. And then the American Marshall Plan, that's going to pump out over $15 billion of American economic aid into Western Europe, was seen by the Soviets as a way to control Europe economically. The Soviets, for their part, countered with the development of Comecon, which is the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, that was meant to link the economies of the Soviet Union with their Eastern European satellite states, essentially leading those Eastern European states to have the same kind of Stalinist, collectivist, nationalized industry economies as the Soviet Union had already created for itself. These countries were also great powers that had existed before World War II. Both the United States and earlier Russia and now the Soviet Union could be seen as expansionist powers since the 19th century. And maybe these early years of the Cold War is just the United States and the Soviet Union continuing to expand their overseas empires, whether they are directly or indirectly controlled. These two countries were the only superpowers left in a post-war world, and each sees the opportunity to expand and have greater influence in a war-torn Europe. Each countries also have fears and suspicions of their opponent. The American fears center on the idea that the United States was dealing with the Soviet Union that would try to continue to expand its communist ideology if it was not reined in by an American containment policy. There's a belief that the Soviet Union, and probably a well-founded belief that the Soviet Union was supporting worldwide communist revolutions through Comintern and later Cominform. The detonation of a Soviet atomic bomb by 1949 is going to heighten fears of a growing Soviet Union and the strength that they have. China in 1949 becoming a communist nation, and the subsequent Korean invasion, North Korea into South Korea in 1950, is giving the United States fears that this Soviet ideology is expanding into Asia. Now, the Soviets, for their part, had fears as well that the United States was conquering Europe not with tanks and guns, but with their economy, with this dollar imperialism. The Soviet Union was also concerned that the United States was in a far superior economic position in the aftermath of World War II than that of the Soviet Union. The Americans' establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in the aftermath of the Berlin crisis, presented a military threat to the Soviet Union. Stalin was also deeply suspicious and even paranoid nature, and he believed that all of these Western actions that the United States had taken, both during World War II and in the aftermath, were a direct threat to the Soviet Union and Stalin himself. So do we say that the Soviet Union is responsible for the breakdown of this alliance that existed during World War II? Well, Stalin did not keep his promise of free elections in either Poland or other Eastern European countries following World War II. The Soviet armies remained in Iran following the Second World War, and they ultimately needed to be forced out by the United Nations in 1946. Soviet armies were also staying in all of the liberated Eastern European countries, as well as the lands that the Soviet Union liberated from the Japanese in Asia. The Berlin blockade was aggressive and signaled a possible attack from the Soviets on West Berlin or West Germany. And the establishment of Cominform to grow and control those communist parties in Europe was all seen as aggressive actions by the United States and could be seen as reasons why this was all the Soviet Union's fault. Or maybe it's the Americans' fault. The use of the atomic bombs at the end of World War II, whose use is debatable. You know, the argument is that Japan was already defeated with conventional weapons, and the United States did not need to use 2 or maybe even 1 atomic bomb. That was to demonstrate American military superiority over the Soviets. And so it was an American aggressive act. The United States was, of course, pushing its own political and economic ideals onto Europe in the aftermath of the war. The Americans failed to recognize what the Soviet Union had gone through in the previous 2 wars, 2 invasions from Germany that were incredibly costly. And the Soviets' desire for their own internal security was not recognized appropriately by the United States, according to some. The Americans had views that all communism around the world was linked to the Soviet Union. And this was misplaced early on, as we already know that the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, Tito and Yugoslavia, are not seeing eye to eye. Yet we still viewed any communist movement as a movement connected to the Soviet Union. And then that establishment of NATO by the United States and our Western allies was seen by Stalin as a threat to the security of the Soviet Union. Again, these could all be factors that led the United States to being responsible for the Grand Alliance. So what is it? It's really going to depend on what school of thought you're going to fit into. The Orthodox view, now we use this word Orthodox generally to mean like kind of the original, or the mainstream, or the conventional wisdom view. The original view of the origin of the Cold War from an American perspective is that it was primarily the Soviet Union's fault, that they were the ones responsible for the Cold War because they were expansionists. The United States, through the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and the Berlin Airlift and the creation of NATO, the United States was just being defensive. In the 1960s, we see the development of what's called a revisionist view. This is after the Red Scare of the 1950s and the beginning and some questions about the Vietnam conflict for the United States, that the United States was responsible for the Cold War. Maybe that containment developed to secure markets and free trade to support the needs of an American capitalist system rather than the security of the wider world. It was just essentially to line the pockets of American businesses and the American economy. Or that the United States was aggressively expanding its economic reach in the post-war world through programs like the Marshall Plan. In the 1970s and 80s, a post-revisionist view grew that synthesized a lot of the ideas from both the orthodoxy and the revisionists, where neither the United States nor the Soviet Union held sole responsibility for the origins of the Cold War, that each party had misconceptions of the other and lack of understanding of the positions of the other side, and that played a role in the breakup in the early Cold War. Both were also overestimating the strength of their opponent, which caused them in turn to react maybe more forcefully than they otherwise would have. Now, after 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet documents became more available to historians, including Western historians who could now travel to Russia and do their own research through Soviet archives. And these post-Cold War historians, these historians of the 90s to today, have this new access to information. And ultimately, they confirm and they support a lot of the post-revisionist notions that both the United States and the Soviet Union played a role in the origin of this Cold War situation. But the post-Cold War view, once they got more into Soviet documents, definitely give more of a role to Joseph Stalin and his paranoia and concerns that these Western nations were just out to get him, and his role is going to grow as being a responsible party in the development of this conflict overall. We want to recognize that Europe and the Soviet Union and Russia share some different viewpoints here from their historical perspectives. Now, for Europe, we've got a Western Europe that is much closer to the Soviet Union and sees the Soviet Union and their expansion as a much bigger threat than maybe the United States would have to, with an Atlantic Ocean separating us from Europe. And Western Europe was keenly aware that they wanted the United States to be involved in Western Europe to defend Western European countries from an expanding Soviet Union. So arguments have been made that Europe, in particular Britain and Winston Churchill, wanted to make sure the United States was aware of the Soviet threat in order to have that American support in Western Europe. They wanted continued American military presence for their own security. And that also allowed Western European countries to not have to spend as much of their own resources on their own defense. Europe also recognized that it had more to gain from alliances and connections with the United States because of the United States' wealth than it had from the Soviet Union. Now, Soviet perspectives are kind of the flip of the Americans. You know, if there is a Soviet orthodoxy, it would be that the Cold War origins were all due to American aggressive actions. So essentially, the Soviet orthodoxy would be the American revisionism. Now, there really is no Soviet era revisionism because Soviet historians just were not as free as American historians to write those kinds of histories. Kind of like American historians would have been during the 1950s Red Scare. They wouldn't have been as free to write anything critical of the United States. So we really don't have a Soviet version of the revisionist history. But after the Cold War ended, Soviet historians, Russian historians did find a little bit more freedom in their own ability to tell their own story based on their own documents. And they also lay more blame at the hands of Stalin and his paranoia and suspicion for causing the Cold War. Thank you, and we will see you next time.